Welcome, dear dreamer. Tonight, we journey beyond the fading sun, where shadows whisper and hope flickers like a spark. Here, in the land of Solara, a young leader named Elara carries the weight of her people's future. Together, we shall walk through forests of mystery, climb mountains of ash, and meet the dragon whose fire can awaken the dawn. Let your heart rest. Let your mind drift, and allow the story to guide you into sleep's gentle embrace. This is not only a tale of dragons and fire, but of courage, sacrifice, and the light that never truly dies. The village of Solara had once basked under the warmth of the brightest sun, its rays nurturing crops, guiding travelers, and ensuring the cycle of life. But now, the sun's light had dimmed. The sky, once a vibrant canvas of blue and gold, now hung heavy with gray clouds that never seemed to part. The fields, where golden wheat once swayed in the wind, had turned dry and barren. A chill lingered in the air. Even in the heart of summer, the villagers whispered of a curse, a punishment from the gods, or perhaps something far worse. Elara stood at the edge of the village, gazing toward the distant horizon where the sun should have been shining. But all that remained was a dull, fading glow, like a dying ember in a hearth long forgotten. She tightened the grip on her cloak as the cold bit at her skin. As the village leader, it was her duty to protect her people. But how could she protect them from something as vast as the failing sun? The elders speak of the old stories, came a voice from behind her. Elara turned to see Darian, his tall frame silhouetted against the dim light. His brow was furrowed, the worry in his eyes mirroring her own. The prophecy, he continued, his voice low. They say the sun was never eternal. It was bound to fade one day. Elara nodded. She had heard the same stories as a child, tales of a dragon whose fire was tied to the very life of the Sunday. The elders called it the sacred flame, a fire so ancient that it could reignite even the dimmest star. But they had also said the dragon was nothing more than a legend, a myth spun by generations of storytellers. "Do you believe it?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darian hesitated. "I don't know, but I do know that we can't sit here and wait for the world to die." Elara's gaze hardened. She knew he was right. The village had already begun to fall into despair, crops failing, livestock growing weak, and children's laughter replaced with the quiet murmur of fear. If they did nothing, their world would succumb to darkness, just as the old prophecy foretold. That night, the village council gathered, their faces grim as they sat around the fire, its flames the only source of warmth in the hall. The elders, wise with age, spoke in low tones of the prophecy, of the dragon, and its sacred fire. "We do not even know if the dragon exists," one elder, Osric, said, his voice laced with skepticism. "And if it does, how could we possibly find it? The world beyond Solara is treacherous. Even if Elara and her people survive the journey, what makes us think the dragon will help us?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the council. Elara, sitting at the head of the table, listened silently. When the room grew quiet, she stood, her eyes fierce as she spoke. "We may not know if the dragon is real, but we know for certain that if we stay here and do nothing, our village will perish. We cannot let fear of the unknown stop us. If the sacred fire is real, it is our only hope. We owe it to our people to try." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one spoke. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the room. Then, slowly, one of the younger council members, Mara, nodded. "Elara is right. We cannot wait for death to find us here. Darian stood next, his voice strong. I will go with her. We will find the dragon. One by one, the other council members agreed, though their faces betrayed the doubt in their hearts. Elara didn't blame them. She, too, was afraid of what lay ahead. But she knew that fear was a luxury they could no longer afford. The council gifted Elara with the village's sacred amulet, an ancient relic said to have been passed down from the time of the first Sunday. It glowed faintly in the dim light, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there was always a glimmer of hope. As Elara prepared to leave, she stood once more at the edge of the village, the weight of her responsibility heavy on her shoulders. The journey ahead would be perilous, and there was no guarantee of success. But for the sake of her people, she would venture into the unknown. Somewhere, in the distant lands beyond Solara, the dragon awaited, and with it, the hope of rekindling the sun's dying fire. With Darian by her side and the amulet in her hand, Elara set out, her heart filled with both fear and determination. The fate of the village now rested in her hands. The council chamber was still filled with the flickering light of the fire as Elara and Darian stood before the village's elders once again, their faces a mixture of age-worn wisdom and deep uncertainty. The air was heavy with apprehension. It was clear that while they had agreed to Elara's quest, doubts lingered like shadows in their minds. Osric, the oldest and most conservative of the elders, rose to speak. His voice was sharp but weary. Elara, you are young, brave, and no doubt capable, but you lead us into a legend. Dragons have not been seen for centuries, perhaps even longer. How do we know this sacred fire is more than an old tale spun by those desperate for hope? Elara met his gaze, her heart steady despite the simmering anxiety within her. We don't know for certain, Osric, but we do know the sun is fading, and our village will not survive if we sit idly by. Would you have us perish in darkness while we wait for a sign that may never come? Osric frowned, his bony fingers gripping the back of a chair. And what if the dragon is real? How do you expect to control a creature born of fire and fury? Do you think it will simply hand over its power like a gift? The fire you seek may burn you alive. Other council members murmured in agreement, their fear evident. Even Mara, the one who had supported Elara earlier, now looked troubled. But before Elara could respond, Darian spoke up, his voice filled with the steady confidence of a warrior. The dragon may be fierce, but we are not without protection. We have the sacred amulet, and we are not children lost in the wilds. We have trained our whole lives for moments like this, moments where courage must rise above fear. You may doubt the dragon, but you cannot doubt Elara. She has led our village through droughts and storms. She will lead us through this. A silence fell over the room. Elara felt a warmth in her chest at Darian's words, a reassurance that she wasn't walking this path alone. But the council remained hesitant. At last, Elder Celine, who had been quietly observing, stood up. Her silver hair framed a face that had seen many seasons of hardship, but her eyes still gleamed with the sharpness of a hawk. We have always trusted in the strength of our people, and we have always survived by daring to hope when others would despair. I will not pretend this quest is without danger, but I will also not let us fall into ruin because we were too afraid to act. She walked slowly toward Elara, placing a hand on her shoulder. You have my blessing, Elara. May the gods watch over you and your companions. With Celine's endorsement, the tide of doubt seemed to shift. One by one, the other council members nodded in reluctant agreement. Even Osric, though still scowling, muttered a few words of support. Elara's heart lightened slightly, but she knew the hardest part still lay ahead. With the council's blessing came the burden of expectation. If they failed, it would not just be their lives at stake. It would be the future of every soul in Solara. The council dispersed, and the room grew quiet, save for the crackling fire. Elara turned to Darian, who was adjusting the straps of his leather armor. "You were bold in there," she said, a hint of a smile playing on her lips. Darian shrugged. Bold or foolish, sometimes they feel the same. "We have to succeed," Elara said, her voice low but firm. "I promised them we'd bring back the sacred fire. If the dragon doesn't exist, or if we can't convince it to help us, we will," Darian interrupted, his eyes steady on hers. "We'll find the dragon, and we'll bring back the fire. I've never known you to fail, Elara, and I'm not about to start doubting you now." Elara gave a small nod, though her thoughts remained heavy with the weight of the task ahead. As she walked out of the council chamber and into the cold night, the village was quiet, its people asleep under the dull and fading light of the dying Sunday. In the distance, the forest loomed dark and impenetrable, a stark reminder of the unknown dangers that awaited. They had the council's blessing, but it felt like a fragile thing, like a single spark in the dark. Now, they would need to kindle it into a flame. Tomorrow, they would begin their journey into the forbidden forest, where legends whispered of ancient creatures, forgotten magic, and the dragon whose fire could save them all. Elara closed her eyes for a brief moment, breathing in the cold air. The time for doubt was over. Now, they had to face the shadows and light the way forward. The first light of dawn struggled to break through the thick veil of clouds as Elara and her small band of companions stood at the edge of the forbidden forest. The trees loomed tall and dark, their gnarled branches twisting like the hands of forgotten giants. A low mist clung to the ground, swirling around their feet like ghostly tendrils, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and old magic. Elara glanced at the villagers who had volunteered to join her. Darian, always a solid presence at her side. Mara, the council's youngest member, her face set with determination, despite the fear in her eyes. And two others, Roland and Kira, skilled hunters who had grown up on stories of the forest's dangers. They were a small group, but each one had chosen to face the unknown with her. "We go together," Elara said, her voice steady, though her heart raced in her chest. "We will find the dragon, or we will find the truth of the sacred fire. Either way, we do not return empty-handed." Darian nodded, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "We follow you, Elara. Lead the way." Without another word, they stepped into the forest. The air grew cooler the moment they crossed the threshold, as though the trees themselves were breathing an ancient chill into the land. The path beneath their feet was narrow and overgrown, the roots of the trees snaking out like traps, waiting to ensnare the unwary. But it wasn't the physical dangers that made Elara's skin prickle. It was the oppressive stillness. No birds sang in the branches. No animals scurried in the underbrush. The forest was unnaturally silent, as though it had been holding its breath for centuries, waiting for something to disturb its slumber. As they ventured deeper, the trees closed in around them, their trunks so wide and ancient that they blotted out what little light the sky had offered. The further they went, the more disorienting the landscape became, with paths twisting and vanishing, only to reappear in strange places. It was as though the forest itself was alive, shifting and reshaping to confuse any who dared to enter. "We've been walking for hours," Mara whispered, her voice tight with unease. "Are we even on the right path?" Elara stopped, scanning the surrounding trees. She could feel it too, the forest was playing tricks on them, bending space and time to its will. "There is no right path here," she said softly. "Only forward." Darian stepped closer to her, his brow furrowed. "Something doesn't feel right. I've heard stories of travelers who entered these woods and never returned. They say the forest is cursed, that it twists your mind until you lose yourself. Cursed or not, we have no choice but to keep moving," Elara replied, though she could feel the same sense of dread creeping into her own mind. As they pressed on, strange shadows flickered at the edges of their vision, shapes that seemed to move just beyond the corner of their eyes, but vanished the moment they turned to look. Whispers filled the air, so faint that they were almost imperceptible, like the distant murmur of voices from another world. But every now and then, Elara could catch a word, a fragment of meaning that sent a chill down her spine. Lost, turn back, not welcome. They continued, every step more treacherous than the last, until they came upon an ancient stone structure, half buried in the earth. It looked like a shrine, though its purpose had long been forgotten. Moss-covered carvings lined the stones, depicting strange figures and runes that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. "This place," Roland began, his voice hushed with awe. "It's like something out of the old stories." "It's a warning," Kira muttered, her hand gripping her bow tightly. "Look at the symbols. They're meant to keep something out or in." Elara knelt before the shrine, tracing her fingers over the carvings. The runes were ancient, but she could sense their meaning. The forest had been home to great power once, power that had been sealed away by those who feared it. But whether that power was the dragon or something far worse, she couldn't yet tell. "We're close," she said, standing. "The dragon's lair must be beyond this forest. We have to keep going." Before anyone could respond, a low growl echoed from the shadows. The group froze, weapons ready, as a pair of glowing eyes emerged from the darkness. A massive creature stepped forward, its fur black as night, and its fangs gleaming in the dim light. It was unlike anything Elara had ever seen, half beast, half shadow, its form shifting like smoke. The creature snarled, its gaze fixed on Elara. For a moment, fear gripped her heart. But then, from the pouch at her side, the sacred amulet began to glow faintly, casting a soft golden light across the clearing. The creature hesitated, its growl fading into a low, guttural sound. Darian stepped forward, sword drawn. "Elara, get back." "No," she said, holding up a hand. "It's not attacking." She took a cautious step forward, holding the amulet out before her. The creature's eyes followed the light, and as the glow grew brighter, the beast slowly backed away into the shadows, vanishing as suddenly as it had appeared. The forest was silent once more. "We need to move," Elara said, her heart still pounding in her chest. "There are forces here we don't understand, but the amulet, it protected us." Darian nodded, sheathing his sword. "Then let's hope it continues to." With a deep breath, Elara led them forward, deeper into the forbidden forest, where the shadows grew darker and the path more uncertain. Somewhere ahead, the dragon awaited, and with it, the hope of rekindling the dying Sunday. The deeper Elara and her companions ventured into the forbidden forest, the more the air seemed to hum with ancient, forgotten magic. The trees loomed ever closer, their bark gnarled and twisted as though molded by an unseen force. No breeze stirred the thick mist that clung to the ground, and the shadows seemed to watch them, always just beyond their reach. It wasn't long before they came upon a clearing. its borders marked by towering stones covered in moss and vines. At the center stood a lone figure, hooded and cloaked in dark robes that seemed to shift with the light, blending into the mist like smoke. His back was to them, yet Elara sensed that he had known of their presence long before they arrived. Darian's hand went instinctively to his sword, but Elara held out her arm to stop him. "Wait," she whispered. There was something about the figure that felt ancient, yet not hostile. The hooded man slowly turned, revealing a face etched with age and wisdom, his eyes glowing faintly with a soft amber light. His voice, when he spoke, was as deep and resonant as the earth itself. "You seek the dragon," he said, his gaze fixed on Elara. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact. "And you carry the amulet of Solara. It has been a long time since anyone from your village dared set foot in these woods." Elara stepped forward, her heart steady despite the tension hanging in the air. "I am Elara, leader of Solara. We seek the sacred fire to reignite the Sunday. Our village is dying, and if we do nothing, we will all perish." The sorcerer's gaze flicked to the amulet hanging from her neck, the faint golden light pulsing as though in response to his presence. He nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth only he understood. "I am Kale," he said, "and I have been watching over this forest for longer than you can imagine. The dragon you seek is real, but its fire is not a simple thing to take. The flame you hope to harness is bound to the life of the sun itself. To awaken it is to awaken forces far greater than you can comprehend." Darian stepped forward, his expression hard. "We don't have a choice. Without that fire, the sun will die. We've heard the stories, the prophecies. They all point to the dragon as our only hope." Kale's eyes gleamed with something like sorrow. Prophecies often speak in half-truths. The fire of the dragon can reignite the sun, yes, but the cost may be far greater than your village is prepared to pay. Elara frowned, her mind racing. "What do you mean?" Kale turned toward the ancient stones that surrounded the clearing. His fingers traced the moss-covered runes carved into the rock, symbols that shimmered faintly under his touch. "The dragon's fire is not a gift to be given lightly. It was sealed away centuries ago, not just to protect the sun, but to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. The sacred fire is a force of creation and destruction. If you awaken the dragon, it may choose to burn more than just the sun back to life." Silence fell over the clearing. The weight of Kale's words pressed down on Elara like a leaden cloak. She had come seeking hope, but now she was faced with a terrible truth. The power they sought could just as easily destroy them. "What would you have us do?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "We cannot let our people die without trying." Kale's eyes softened, and for a moment, the ancient sorcerer looked almost weary, as though he carried the burden of knowledge too long. "I cannot stop you from seeking the dragon," he said, "but I can offer you guidance. The sacred fire will test you. It will ask of you a sacrifice, something that may cost you dearly, and once you awaken the dragon, there will be no turning back." Elara met his gaze, the weight of her responsibility settling in her chest like a stone. She thought of her people, of the children who would never see another summer if the sun's light continued to fade. She thought of the council, of Osric's doubts and Mara's quiet hope, but most of all, she thought of her own promise to bring light back to Solara, no matter the cost. "We are ready," she said, her voice steady. Kale studied her for a long moment before he nodded. "Then follow the path that leads to the mountain of ash. It is there that the dragon slumbers, waiting for one worthy enough to wield its fire. But remember this, not all who seek the flame survive its wrath. With a wave of his hand, the mist around the stones began to part, revealing a narrow trail winding through the forest, leading toward distant, jagged peaks that rose like the teeth of a sleeping giant. "May the gods watch over you," Kale said, his voice barely a whisper as he turned and disappeared into the shadows. For a moment, the group stood in silence, the weight of the sorcerer's warning heavy on their shoulders. Then, with a determined nod, Elara led the way toward the path that would take them to the dragon. As they ventured deeper into the unknown, the words of the prophecy echoed in her mind. The fire of the sun lies in the heart of the beast, but those who seek it must tread carefully, for fire burns all it touches. Elara tightened her grip on the amulet, feeling its warmth against her skin. The journey had only just begun, but already the stakes had become far greater than she could have imagined. Ahead, the shadow of the mountain of ash loomed ever closer. The path to the mountain of ash was steep and unforgiving, its jagged rocks cutting into the soles of their boots as Elara and her companions climbed higher into the desolate range. The air had grown thin and acrid, laced with the scent of sulfur and burning embers that rose from deep fissures in the earth. Above them, the mountain's peak was obscured by thick clouds of ash, casting the land in an eerie twilight, even as the sun struggled to shine through the veil of smoke. Elara's heart pounded with each step, both from the exertion of the climb and the growing sense of dread that hung over their journey. The words of Kale, the sorcerer, echoed in her mind. "The sacred fire will test you. It will ask for a sacrifice." The warning had clung to her thoughts, like the ash that now covered their clothes. What sacrifice would the dragon demand? What price would they have to pay to reignite the sun? Darian walked beside her, his face grim and focused. He had remained silent since they left the sorcerer's clearing, though Elara could sense the same tension in him that gnawed at her own resolve. Behind them, Mara, Roland, and Kira followed, their eyes scanning the barren landscape for any sign of danger. The forest's dense trees had long since given way to a wasteland of blackened earth and jagged rocks. Here, nothing grew, no plants, no animals, only silence and ash. "We're getting close," Darian said, his voice low but steady. He pointed to a distant rise where a massive cave mouth yawned at the base of the mountain's peak, smoke curling from its depths like the breath of some slumbering beast. "That must be the dragon's lair." Elara nodded, though the sight of the cave filled her with unease. The air around them had grown warmer, the ground trembling beneath their feet, as if the mountain itself was alive, pulsing with the power of the creature that dwelled within. As they neared the cave, a deep rumbling sound echoed from within, followed by a gust of hot, acrid wind that sent ash swirling around them in blinding clouds. Elara shielded her face, her eyes watering as the wind howled through the jagged rocks. The very earth seemed to groan under the weight of an ancient force stirring from its long slumber. "We have to go in," she said, her voice barely audible over the wind. Her hands tightened around the sacred amulet, its warmth a faint comfort against the growing heat that radiated from the cave. Darian drew his sword, the blade gleaming faintly in the dim light. "Stay close," he said, his voice firm but tense. "Whatever happens, we face it together." Together, they entered the dragon's lair. The cave walls were rough and jagged, the air inside thick with heat and smoke. The ground beneath their feet was littered with the charred remains of bones and crumbling stone, as though the mountain itself had once been consumed by the fire of the dragon that lived within. The deeper they ventured, the more the air shimmered with heat, warping the shadows that danced along the walls. At last, they came to the heart of the cave, a vast chamber lit by the glow of molten rock that bubbled and churned in a deep pool at its center. And there, rising from the darkness like a force of nature itself, was the dragon, Ignis. The creature was immense, its body covered in scales that shimmered like molten gold, each one reflecting the fiery light of the molten lava below. Its wings were folded against its back, but even at rest, they seemed to fill the chamber, their edges lined with embers that flickered and burned like dying stars. The dragon's eyes, two orbs of molten fire, opened slowly as it sensed their presence, and a low, rumbling growl echoed from its throat, reverberating through the cavern like a thunderclap. Elara froze, her heart pounding in her chest as the dragon's gaze settled on her. She could feel the weight of its ancient power pressing down on her, a force so immense and overwhelming that it seemed to crush the very air from her lungs. For a moment, the enormity of the task before her threatened to break her resolve, but then the amulet at her neck flared with warmth, a gentle reminder of the hope she carried, the hope of her village, of her people who were waiting for her to bring back the light. She stepped forward, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "Great Dragon Ignis," she called, her words echoing through the cavern. "I am Elara, leader of Solara. We have come to seek your sacred fire, to reignite the dying sun and save our world from darkness." For a long moment, the dragon said nothing. Its fiery eyes bore into her, as if searching the depths of her soul, weighing her worth. Then, with a voice like the crackling of 1,000 flames, Ignis spoke. "You seek the fire of the sun, mortal." Elara nodded, her heart racing. "Yes, without it, my people will perish. The sun is fading. We need your fire to reignite it." The dragon's growl deepened, a sound that shook the very ground beneath their feet. "The sacred fire is no mere flame to be given freely. It is bound to the heart of the world, to the balance of all things. To wield it is to invite both creation and destruction. Are you prepared for the cost it demands?" Elara's breath caught in her throat. The cost. "I am," she said, her voice resolute. "Whatever the price, I will pay it." The dragon's eyes gleamed with a terrible ancient wisdom. "Then prove your worth, mortal. The fire will test you. Only those who are worthy may wield its power." As Ignis's words rumbled through the cavern, the molten pool beneath them began to surge, flames leaping into the air like tendrils of living fire. Elara could feel the heat rising, the ground trembling as the dragon's test began. Whatever the fire demanded, she would face it. For the sake of her people, for the sake of the sun, she would endure. The trial of fire had begun. The air within the cavern shimmered as the dragon's power surged, filling the vast chamber with a searing heat. Elara stood at the edge of the molten pool, her breath quick and shallow, the weight of the dragon's gaze pressing down on her like a mountain. The flames danced before her, wild and untamed, as though they had a will of their own. It was no ordinary fire, this was the sacred fire, bound to the life of the sun itself, a force as ancient and unyielding as the cosmos. Ignis, the great dragon, unfolded its massive wings with a slow, deliberate movement. Embers scattered from its scales, lighting the cavern with a fiery glow. Its voice rumbled through the air, deep and resonant, like the crackling of burning wood. "Mortal," it began, its molten eyes fixed on Elara. You seek the flame of the sun, but you do not yet understand the price it demands. Elara's hands trembled at her sides, though she kept her chin high. I am ready to pay that price, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Whatever it takes to save my people, I will endure. Ignis's eyes narrowed, its tail curling and uncurling with the slow grace of a predator considering its prey. Words are easy, mortal, but the fire knows truth from lies. It will burn away the falsehoods of the heart, reveal your fears, your weaknesses. Only those who face their inner darkness can claim the flame. Step forward and face the trial. The dragon's words echoed in Elara's mind as she stared into the molten pool before her. The flames leaped higher, licking at the edges of the stone, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She hesitated for a moment, fear gnawing at the edge of her resolve. But the image of her village, cold and dying, rose in her mind, pushing her forward. She couldn't fail them. She wouldn't fail them. With a deep breath, she stepped into the light of the sacred fire. As soon as she crossed the threshold, the world around her shifted. The cavern, the dragon, her companions, they all vanished, replaced by a blinding light and a strange, suffocating silence. Elara stood alone, surrounded by nothingness, as though she had stepped into a dream. But she knew this was no dream. This was the trial of fire, the test that would determine her worth. A voice, soft and insidious, echoed in the void. What do you fear most, Elara of Solara? Elara's heart raced. The voice was not her own, nor was it the dragon's feast. It was something deeper, something ancient and powerful. She swallowed hard, trying to calm herself. I fear failing my people, she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. I fear watching them suffer while I can do nothing. The voice laughed, cold and mocking. A noble answer, but not the truth. What do you truly fear? Suddenly, the nothingness around her shifted, and Elara found herself standing in the middle of her village. But it wasn't the village she knew. The sky above was dark, the sun completely extinguished, and the air was cold as death. The fields were barren, the houses crumbling. All around her, the villagers were shadows of their former selves, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes hollow. She tried to move, but her feet were rooted to the ground. Helpless, she watched as the villagers turned toward her, their empty eyes filled with accusation. You failed us, they whispered, their voices like the rustling of dry leaves. You promised to save us, but you let us die. Elara's heart clenched in her chest. No, she cried, struggling to free herself from the invisible chains that held her. I tried. I'm still trying. But the voices grew louder, more insistent. You were not strong enough. You were not wise enough. You were not worthy. Tears stung her eyes as the weight of their words pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. Was this what she feared most? That no matter how hard she tried, it wouldn't be enough? That she would lose her people, lose her home, despite all her efforts? The flames around her flickered, casting long shadows across the ruined village. Elara's breath came in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. But deep inside, beneath the fear, a spark of defiance ignited. She had come too far to give in now. She would not let her fear break her. With a surge of determination, Elara tore her gaze from the accusing faces and focused on the fire at the heart of the village. The sacred fire, still burning bright even in this vision of despair. The voices of the villagers faded as she walked toward it, each step lighter, her heart steadier. I am not perfect, she whispered, her voice gaining strength. I am not without fear, but I will not let that stop me." As her words rang through the air, the shadows began to retreat, the cold dissipating. The village before her faded, and once again, she stood before the dragon, the trial complete. Ignis watched her, its fiery eyes filled with an inscrutable expression. "You have faced your fear and proven your worth. The fire recognizes you." With a great roar, the dragon spread its wings wide, and from its maw, a single brilliant ember floated toward Elara. It hovered in the air for a moment before settling in her hand, glowing with a heat that was both fierce and comforting. The sacred fire had chosen her. The trial was over, but the journey was far from finished. With the ember of the sacred fire in her grasp, Elara turned to her companions. Their faces reflected a mixture of awe and relief, though they too knew that this was only the beginning. They had to get the flame back to the Sunday, and there would be those who would stop at nothing to take it from them. The final leg of their journey was about to begin. Elara stood in the heart of the cavern, the sacred fire burning in her hand, a single golden ember, no larger than a pebble, yet pulsing with the power of the sun itself. The heat from it radiated outward, warming her skin and filling the air with the scent of burning ozone. Around her, the dragon's lair seemed to hum with energy, the molten rock at the cavern's center glowing more brightly, as though it, too, acknowledged the gravity of the moment. Ignis, the great dragon, watched her closely, his molten eyes never leaving the ember. The massive creature seemed almost still, as though the weight of centuries had settled over him once more. The trial had ended, but Elara could feel the lingering tension in the air. She had been deemed worthy, but now she had to carry the fire back to the heart of the Sunday. And that journey, she knew, would not be easy. Her companions stood a few paces behind her, their faces etched with both awe and trepidation. Darian's hand rested on the hilt of his sword, his eyes scanning the cavern for any signs of danger. Mara and Roland exchanged uneasy glances, while Kira, ever watchful, kept her bow at the ready. They had witnessed Elara face the trial, had seen the sacred fire choose her, but now the question loomed heavy in the air. What next? Ignis's voice broke the silence, rumbling like distant thunder. "You carry the flame, mortal, but the path ahead is fraught with danger. There are those who would seek to claim the fire for themselves, to wield it for purposes far darker than your own." Elara's grip on the ember tightened, its warmth steadying her. She had expected as much. "Who would seek the flame?" she asked, her voice steady despite the knot of anxiety forming in her chest. The dragon's eyes gleamed with ancient knowledge. The shadows of this world are many, and there are those who hunger for power above all else. The fire you carry is not merely a spark of the Sunday. It is creation itself, a force that can bend the will of the universe. There are dark sorcerers, creatures born of night and flame, who would stop at nothing to take it from you. Darian stepped forward, his face hard with determination. "Let them come. We will protect the fire with our lives." Ignis turned his fiery gaze upon him, and for a moment, Darian seemed small beneath the weight of that stare. "Your courage is commendable, mortal, but courage alone will not protect the flame. It will take more than swords and strength to see it safely to the Sunday. The fire demands something greater." Elara felt the weight of those words settle over her like a heavy cloak. She knew what the dragon meant. The fire had chosen her, and now it required more than just her physical strength. It would test her heart, her will, and her ability to sacrifice for the greater good. But what exactly would it demand? "The journey ahead will be long," Ignis continued, his voice deep and resonant. The flame must be taken to the altar of the sun, high in the peaks of the celestial mountains. There, the ember will rekindle the heart of the Sunday, but beware, the fire is volatile. If it is not treated with the utmost care, it could burn away all life, plunging your world into eternal darkness. Elara nodded, the gravity of the task settling over her. The celestial mountains were far beyond the village of Solara, a range so high and treacherous that few had ever dared to cross them. It would take everything they had to make the journey, but she knew they had no choice. The sun was fading, and time was running out. "We will succeed," she said, her voice firm with resolve. "We must." Ignis's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer before he slowly folded his wings against his back, his massive body settling into a more relaxed posture. "Go then, bearer of the sacred fire, but remember this: the fire you carry is both a gift and a burden. It will test you at every turn. Should you falter, it will consume you." With those final words, the dragon turned away, his great form retreating into the shadows of the cavern. The glow of the molten rock dimmed slightly as the creature disappeared from view, leaving Elara and her companions alone with the weight of their mission. For a moment, there was silence. Then Darian, ever the protector, placed a hand on Elara's shoulder. "We need to move quickly," he said. "If there are others who seek the fire, we can't afford to linger." Elara nodded, slipping the ember into a small velvet pouch that hung from her belt. The warmth of it seeped through the fabric, a constant reminder of the power she now carried. The group began their descent from the mountain of ash, the treacherous path winding down toward the distant forest below. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur, and the sky above was still choked with ash, but Elara's mind was already racing ahead, trying to calculate the next steps. They had the sacred fire, but their journey was only just beginning. The celestial mountains awaited, and with them, the final test that would determine the fate of her people and the world. As they moved into the shadows of the forest, Elara couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them from the darkness. Something hungry, waiting for its chance to strike. And with each step, the ember grew warmer. The forest that lay beneath the mountain of ash had transformed in their absence. What had once been a place of silence and shadows now thrummed with an ominous energy, as if the very trees knew of the sacred fire Elara carried. The path ahead twisted like a serpent, obscured by thick mist and heavy branches that swayed as though moved by unseen hands. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of their mission bore down on them with increasing force. Elara walked at the head of the group, the velvet pouch containing the ember tied securely at her waist. Though the ember was small, its warmth was undeniable, almost overwhelming. She could feel it pulsing against her hip, each beat like the steady rhythm of a heartbeat, a reminder that the fire was alive, waiting for its moment. Darian stayed close, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword, eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement. The others, Mara, Roland, and Kira, moved quietly behind them, their steps cautious. None of them spoke, the silence between them heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. The celestial mountains loomed in the distance, their peaks obscured by clouds, but the journey to reach them would be treacherous. "We're being followed," Kira whispered suddenly, her sharp gaze sweeping the trees behind them. "I can feel it." Elara stopped, her hand instinctively reaching for the pouch at her side. The sacred fire seemed to pulse harder, a warning in itself. She turned to look at Kira, whose eyes were narrowed, scanning the tree line. "Can you see anything?" Elara asked, her voice hushed. "No," Kira replied. But it's there. Something's watching us. Darian's grip on his sword tightened, his body tensed and ready. We need to move faster, he said, his tone urgent. Whatever it is, it's waiting for us to let our guard down. Elara nodded, but before she could take another step, the forest around them erupted in chaos. Out of the mist, figures emerged, dark, shadowy forms that seemed to melt from the very trees themselves. Their shapes were unnatural, twisting and writhing, as though made of smoke and shadow, their eyes glowing with a cold, unnatural light. There were no words, no battle cries, just a sudden, violent surge as the creatures descended upon them, weapons drawn. "Protect the fire!" Darian shouted, drawing his sword and charging toward the nearest figure. His blade met the shadowy creature's weapon with a sharp clang, but the figure didn't move like a man. It was quick, unnaturally quick, and its form seemed to shift and blur with each movement, making it hard to strike. Roland and Kira joined the fray, their own weapons flashing in the dim light as they tried to fend off the attackers. Mara, unarmed, stayed close to Elara, her eyes wide with fear. Elara backed away, her hand instinctively tightening around the pouch. The sacred fire pulsed wildly now, its heat almost unbearable, as if it sensed the danger. She knew she couldn't allow these creatures to take it whatever they were. They had come for the fire, and if they succeeded, the world would fall into darkness. One of the shadowed figures lunged toward her, its eyes glowing with an eerie hunger. Elara stumbled back, her heart racing, but before it could reach her, Darian was there, his sword slashing through the creature's form. The shadow let out a piercing screech before dissolving into the mist. "Elara, go!" Darian shouted, his voice strained with effort as he fought off another attacker. "We'll hold them off! You need to get the fire to the mountains!" She hesitated, her heart pounding. She didn't want to leave them behind, didn't want to abandon her friends to face these horrors alone. But the sacred fire pulsed again, hotter now, and she knew what had to be done. "Go!" Darian shouted again, his voice fierce. With a deep breath, Elara turned and ran, her feet pounding against the earth as she bolted through the forest. Mara followed close behind her, her breath ragged with fear, but neither of them looked back. The trees blurred around them as they raced forward, the sound of battle fading behind them. But the shadows weren't done. They moved with terrifying speed, slipping through the mist like wraiths, gaining on her with each passing second. Elara could feel their cold presence at her back, the weight of their pursuit pressing down on her like a vice. The fire burned hotter, almost scalding now, but she refused to let go. Ahead, the forest began to thin, and through the mist, she could see the faint outline of a stone altar, an ancient structure, weathered by time, standing at the foot of the mountain. It pulsed with the same energy as the sacred fire, as if calling to it. "That's it!" Mara cried. "The altar of the sun!" Elara pushed herself harder, her legs burning with effort. The shadows were close now, their twisted forms slipping between the trees like predators stalking prey. But the altar was within reach, just a few more steps. With a final burst of speed, Elara reached the altar. She climbed its stone steps, the heat from the ember in her pouch growing unbearable. She could feel the shadows closing in, their cold breath at her neck, but she refused to falter. She reached the top of the altar and with trembling hands pulled the ember from the pouch. It glowed fiercely in her palm, a tiny flame that burned brighter than the Sunday. She placed it at the center of the altar, where an ancient, weathered inscription glowed faintly in the stone. The moment the ember touched the altar, the world seemed still. Then, With a roar that shook the heavens, the sacred fire exploded into light. The shadows screeched in agony, their forms dissolving into the light as the power of the fire surged upward, reaching toward the sky. The sun, faint and flickering, suddenly flared to life, its golden light blazing across the land. The darkness was gone. Elara collapsed to her knees, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with exhaustion. The fire had been returned. The sun had been reignited, but as she looked up at the bright sky above, she knew the final battle was still to come. The world glowed golden under the newly reignited sun, its light spreading warmth across the landscape. But Elara felt none of its comfort. She remained on her knees at the altar, her breath ragged, the remnants of the sacred fire's explosive power still crackling in the air. The radiant energy from the fire had burned away the shadows, yet a strange, uneasy silence settled around her. Mara, exhausted and wide-eyed, knelt beside her, still catching her breath. "It worked," Mara whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. "The fire, the sun, it's shining again." Elara looked up, her heart pounding as she gazed at the blazing sun high in the sky. Its light was vibrant and alive, no longer the dull, dying orb it had been just hours ago. A feeling of awe swept over her. She had done it. They had saved the world from falling into darkness. But even in this moment of triumph, something gnawed at the edges of her mind. The dragon's words echoed in her ears. "The fire demands a cost." What was the price? Elara muttered to herself, her hand trembling as it hovered above the now dormant altar. The ember was gone, absorbed into the stone, its power now feeding the heart of the Sunday. But what had she given in return? Before she could dwell further, the sound of footsteps echoed through the clearing, growing louder with each step. Elara's heart leaped Darian and the others. They had made it. Relief washed over her as she turned, ready to greet her companions. But what emerged from the mist was not her friends. A tall, cloaked figure stepped into the light, its face hidden beneath a deep hood. Dark tendrils of energy swirled around it, and the air seemed to grow colder in its presence, as if the sunlight itself recoiled from the stranger. Elara's breath caught in her throat. There was a darkness in this figure that made the shadows from the forest seem pale in comparison. Mara gasped, stumbling back. What is that?" The figure's voice, when it spoke, was like the grinding of stone, deep and full of malice. "The fire has been returned, but the balance has been broken." The figure stepped forward, the very ground seeming to freeze beneath its feet. "You have taken something that was never yours to claim." Elara scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively moving toward her dagger, though she knew it would be of little use against whatever this was. "Who are you?" she demanded, forcing strength into her voice, despite the fear curling inside her. "I am the reckoner of the fire, the keeper of balance," the figure said, its voice low and thunderous. "The sacred fire is not a gift. It is a force of creation and destruction, and you, mortal, have tipped the scales." Elara's heart raced. She could feel the power radiating from the figure, an ancient, malevolent energy that pressed against her like a tidal wave. "I did what I had to," she said, her voice shaking but defiant. The sun was dying. Without the fire, my people, our world would have perished. The figure's hood tilted slightly, as if considering her words, but there was no mercy in its stance. "And now, the balance of the world hangs in jeopardy. The fire you returned has created new life, but it has also awakened forces that were meant to stay dormant." Elara's stomach turned. She had heard the stories of dark sorcerers, Ancient beings who had once sought the power of the sun for themselves, only to be sealed away. Could they have been released when she reignited the fire? Mara stepped forward, her voice trembling but brave. We didn't mean to break any balance. We were trying to save the Sunday. The figure's gaze shifted to Mara, and for a moment, the air seemed to chill even further. Ignorance does not absolve you of consequence, child. A low growl rumbled from the distance, and suddenly, Darian and the others burst into the clearing, their weapons drawn. "Elara!" Darian shouted, his eyes scanning the scene before him. "Are you all right?" Elara nodded, though her gaze never left the cloaked figure. "Stay back," she warned, her voice tight. This is something far more dangerous than what we've faced before." The figure's dark form seemed to grow, its presence filling the clearing with a suffocating weight. "The fire has been restored," it said, its voice rising like a storm, "but a price must still be paid." Elara felt the ember's warmth, the fire's energy still pulsing within her. She knew in her heart what the figure wanted. She had carried the fire, taken its power into herself, and now it demanded a final cost. "What price?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. The figure stepped closer, its dark energy swirling. "Your life." For a moment, the world seemed to still. Elara's breath caught, and the weight of the dragon's words returned to her with full force. The sacred fire had chosen her, but it had not been a gift. It had been a burden, one that required the ultimate sacrifice. "Elara, no." Darian's voice broke through the silence, raw and desperate. "There has to be another way." Elara turned to him, her heart aching. She had fought so hard, come so far, but now she understood. The fire had always demanded more than strength or courage. It demanded balance. "There is no other way," she said, her voice soft but certain. She looked at her companions, at Darian, Mara, Roland, and Kira. "Take the fire's gift. Protect Solara. Protect the Sunday." Before anyone could protest further, Elara stepped toward the figure. "I am ready." The figure raised its hand, dark energy swirling around it, and the fire inside Elara flared with a fierce, blinding heat. Her body felt light, the warmth enveloping her as she stood before the reckoner. And in that final moment, as the fire consumed her, she knew she had done what was needed. The sun burned bright, and the balance was restored. The reckoning was complete.